Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to address Bill C-81, an act to ensure a barrier-free Canada, or better known as the Accessible Canada Act. This is a subject near and dear to my heart. You know, as we've heard from various members, we all want to ensure that those living with disabilities are treated as equals, and we want to remove the barriers that they face every single day. Now, Mr. Speaker, I said this is near and dear to my heart, so I'd like to start by providing some insight into some obstacles that I've encountered firsthand living with disabilities in Canada. It was 2006. I had just been named Minister of Human Resources and Social Development with responsibility for the Office for Disabilities. Now, ironically, just a few weeks into the job, I was diagnosed with Graves' disease and Graves' eye disease. Now, these are thyroid afflictions that, among other things, in me, caused both extreme light sensitivity and extreme strabismus, resulting in me being legally blind for quite a period of time. More recently, I underwent complicated double hip replacement surgery, which unfortunately resulted in my need for mobility assistance tools around this place for many, many months. Now, it was during both of these periods that I learned just how inaccessible many things in my life were, including this particular workplace. Simple things, such as moving between the hill and my office more than half a kilometer away from this house, being unable to walk that distance, being unable to take the step up or the step down from the little white minibus. Challenges were also considerable in actually having to fight to get an accessible parking space here at Centre Block. Now, Mr. Speaker, as you'll recall, even with the eventual direct intervention by the Speaker's office, it literally took months to fix what were supposed to be the accessibility doors at the rear of this building, doors that unfortunately malfunctioned more often than not. One of the main barriers to getting that particular job done was a clear lack of accountability for the issue. And I'll talk more about accountability a little bit later. I also discovered how narrow certain parts of these buildings are for those who rely on wheelchairs or walkers that inhibit our ability to get around. Now, with a disability, many of these seemingly small things all of a sudden can become very big obstacles. But you know what, Mr. Speaker? It used to be a lot worse. In fact, under the previous Liberal government, the Office for People with Disabilities was actually 2 offices, and neither one of them was accessible by those who were mobility challenged. That's right, if you used a wheelchair or a walker, you couldn't get into the building. You couldn't work there, you couldn't consult, you couldn't lobby, you couldn't advocate for people with disabilities because you weren't allowed in. I know this may sound a little bit farcical, but unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, it's true. Now, happily, our Conservative government fixed that scenario in short order, and in fact, we combined the facilities. We had one office, and it was built as a showcase of how businesses and organizations could adapt to people with mobility, visibility, hearing, or other challenges. Now, in one place, businesses and other organizations could finally find the technologies, the techniques, the tips, and the tools that would help them accommodate people of all abilities, so that these organizations could benefit from their skills to make those organizations even stronger. Mr. Speaker, by the end, not only could people with disabilities enter this office to do business there, they could actually work there. What a concept. Now, as the former Minister for HRSD responsible for the disabilities file, I have to tell you, I was very proud to be part of a government that took leadership in removing many, many barriers for people with disabilities. Yes, we created the Registered Disabilities Savings Plan in 2008, and yes, we signed on to the UN Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Now, the RDSP, as you've probably heard, was a breakthrough financial planning tool, the first of its kind anywhere in the world. And to date, over 150,000 Canadians and their families have invested in this wonderful, wonderful tool. But we did so much more for people with disabilities. We launched the Opportunities Fund that so far has helped over 20,000 people with disabilities develop the skills that they need to get a job, to actually get a job, and with that, the dignity and self-respect that come with having a job. We partnered with the Canadian Association for Community Living on the Ready, Willing, and Able initiative to connect people with developmental disabilities with a job. We also invested in expanding vocational training programs for people with autism spectrum disorders. More, you say, Mr. Speaker? Yes, we did more. We removed the GST, HST on eyewear that is specially designed to electronically enhance the vision of individuals with vision impairment, and also on special training to help individuals cope with the effects of a disorder or disability. We invested hundreds of millions of dollars every year in the labor market agreements for persons with disabilities to help the provinces and territories improve the employment of Canadians with disabilities in their turn. We released a landmark third-party report, Rethinking Disability in the Private Sector. Now, this report spelled out in very plain language the many tangible benefits of hiring people with disabilities: reduced absenteeism, reduced turnover, improved morale, and improved profitability. And I'm rightly very proud that in 2007, our government created the Enabling Accessibility Fund. Now, this program was designed to provide direct funding to help community groups, municipalities, and organizations improve accessibility for people with disabilities where they work, live, and play, such as community centers, town halls, churches, arenas, and so many more local spots. Over 3,700 facilities were made more accessible through this program, and in 2013, we recognized both the value and the success of it. What was originally billed as a temporary program, and we made the funding permanent. Now, I have to tell you, Mr. Speaker, I never expected over 10 years ago when we launched that particular program, that 10 years later, I would be so appreciative of and in so much need of the results of those investments. But I was sure glad they were there, as are thousands and thousands of Canadians who use them every day. Mr. Speaker, among many other tax aids, we also created the Home Accessibility Tax Credit for both seniors and for those living with disabilities to renovate and make their own homes more accessible, giving them not just a sense of independence, but in fact, real independence. We did this, Mr. Speaker, because we recognize the contributions that people with disabilities can and do make to our nation and our communities, and we recognize the value that a person's independence brings to their dignity. Now, this isn't to say that the accomplishments of our government solved every problem, but they were significant steps in the right direction. And that said, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure members would agree, we still have a lot of work to do. Take, for example, the presentation of petitions right here in this House of Commons. Excuse me. Now, a year ago, almost a year ago exactly, I had a petition from constituents rejected by the clerk of this House because it was on 11 by 17-inch paper, printed big enough to accommodate the constituents of mine who had visual challenges. The paper was deemed too big for the House of Commons by this House of Commons. Now, under the current standing orders, petitioners can only petition the House of Commons if the petition is printed on paper that is described as the usual size, meaning letter or legal size only. And Mr. Speaker, I actually had to seek unanimous consent from this House to table this particular petition. Now, thanks to my colleagues on all sides, unanimous consent was granted and I was allowed to table the petition. But Mr. Speaker, quite frankly, there's so much text that's required to be included on the petition now that the font used has to be pretty small if it's going to fit on an 8.5 by 11 inch piece of paper. Now that's not fair. It's not fair to our constituents. In fact, it's so backwards a policy to limit the size of paper that if all the required information is actually there. And I believe, personally, that every Canadian should be able to submit a petition that's on larger paper if it means that they can actually read what they're signing. I don't think that that's an unreasonable thing to require. Now, as someone who was once legally blind, as the former minister responsible for the Disabilities Office, I regularly encourage many institutions and organizations to adopt more accessible, friendly policies. So it's very disappointing to me that this House isn't taking the same approach, at least not so far. And not only does this guideline fail to provide accessibility to Canadians who are visually impaired, but it's a barrier to them being able to access and fully participate at the same level of engagement with their government as someone without a visibility challenge. Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the House for granting me unanimous consent to table the petition. And frankly, I was hopeful that having this issue brought before the Procedural and House Affairs Committee, or as we know it better, PROC, would lead to positive and permanent change. Sadly, I'm now hearing that of all people, the government members of PROC, the same people who are introducing the Bill C-81, these people are now, for some strange reason, withholding their support for this change that they once seemed to support. Frankly, Mr. Speaker, I don't understand it. Because if the government were truly serious about addressing the issues facing Canadians with disabilities, they would have addressed the standing order by now. Instead, here we are, almost a year later, and Standing Order 36 1.1c still hasn't been updated. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, I wish I could say that this were just an oversight, but sadly, it doesn't seem to be so. You know, during the 2015 election, the Liberals campaigned on a promise to make life more accessible for Canadians with disabilities. And for each cabinet shuffle, it's been part of the minister's mandate letter to consult and introduce legislation on this subject as quickly as possible. Here we are, 3 years later, and we're getting a bill from the minister that is said to have been the result of extreme consultations across Canada. Now, I have no doubt that the minister and her staff did do extensive consultations across the country on this matter. That's what they claim. It must be true. But one would normally have expected something of deeper value and more tangible change to have been proposed as a result. Instead, all that this piece of legislation does is propose the creation of yet another agency at a cost of $290 million to taxpayers. But here's the sad part. None of that money is actually being spent on helping Canadians who face accessibility issues on a day-to-day basis. Instead, it's going to hire more bureaucracy. It's paying for auditors to audit all government buildings and those that fall under federal jurisdiction, such as banks, and to consult still more on what the standard regulations should be for accessibility. Well, Mr. Speaker, in my humble opinion, this is a waste of money. We don't need more consultations to develop regulations. We have those already. As a matter of fact, during our time in government, we spent many millions of dollars making hundreds, I say hundreds, of federal buildings more accessible. And you know what happened? When we put that in the budget, the Liberals voted against it. But we were able to do all of these updates and set regulations without the need of yet another multi-million-dollar agency to develop yet another report. And Mr. Speaker, the proposed legislation says that the regulations, when developed over the next 6 years, would, among other places, apply to the Parliament buildings. So, Mr. Speaker, I have a few questions for the Minister. As members of Parliament, we all have at least 2 offices, one in Ottawa and one, and often more, in the riding. Will those auditors be auditing our constituency offices to ensure that they comply with these new regulations? If so, and if our offices don't comply, who would be responsible for paying for the upgrades? I know from my own experience that it was extremely difficult to find office space that was both accessible and affordable in our small towns. And our members' offices budgets, well, they wouldn't cover the cost to make an office accessible because of the high dollar figure involved. In one case, simply building a ramp and altering the front door to my office would have cost 3 years' rent. 3 years' rent, Mr. Speaker. Now, the landlord couldn't responsibly or reasonably be expected to pay for that, and house management wouldn't pay for it. In addition to our constituency offices, our Parliament buildings were not designed to be disability friendly. And while we, as a government, made great strides in fixing that, these buildings were just not designed with those with accessibility issues in mind. With Centre Block shutting down in a few months for a much-needed 10-plus years renovation, has the Minister made plans to ensure that when this building reopens, it will be disability-friendly for not just Canadians when they visit the Parliament buildings, but for the MPs, senators, and thousands of people who support this institution? For example, will rounded doorknobs be changed over to lever knobs? What about the bathroom sink faucets? The toilet flushers? Will any ramps needed to be built? And will they be built to the appropriate 1:10 ratio? Or how about a distinguished baseboard that will allow someone who has a visual impairment to see where the wall and the floor meet? Will there be visual and audible warnings for people in the event of emergencies? Right now, in my Confederation office building, the fire alarm is an audio-only alarm. Now, that works for me and my staff, but what if I have guests or someone who is a cleaner in there who can't hear? What is planned for wheelchair access to the Hill? And perhaps more importantly, what plans exist for true emergency evacuation by wheelchair or walker? I know that while I was the Minister of Public Works, I took all of these things into consideration and required that they be incorporated into the Parliament Hill renovation design plans. But I have a question. Are those features still included? I know that many of those plans have been changed. So I asked the Minister, will she ensure that Centre Block and the other Parliament buildings will be accessible friendly after these once-in-a-century renovations? Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned earlier, I'm also concerned about the jurisdiction under which this bill is being placed. As the bill currently stands, the Minister for Sports and Disabilities will be responsible for implementing this bill, yet much of the work will require to be executed by Public Works. And I'm concerned that as a result of this, the Minister for Disabilities will be unable to adequately address issues and address these issues as they arise. Mr. Speaker, while I do support sending this legislation to committee and its intended goal, I have some serious concerns over the need to create a new agency, the amount of funding requested, and how the division of responsibility, authority, and accountability for its implementation will be addressed. I am also concerned that this legislation does is essentially reiterate the Minister's mandate letter. She's already consulted with Canadians, so instead we should be discussing the regulations, not the creation of another agency. I look forward to hearing what the other members have to say so that together we can develop legislation that will truly address the very real concerns of very real Canadians with very real disabilities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.